My second full-length novel was primarily a collection of short stories linked together called A Harvest of Marshmallows. And while I was very pleased with the work, which showed a lot of not only Bradbury, but by then the influence of Philip K. Dick with the clarity of reality and alternate reality and time travel and so forth, there were certain problems with the book that caused it not to hold up well over time. Some of the plot lines are just, they've been too co-opted by the narrative of modern communism to be something that I even want to present any longer. In the story, in the Harvest of Marshmallows, tied together, these several different life stories intertwine, including a man whose brother, a black man whose brother is killed by a white police officer accidentally while he is pursuing a criminal, and the healing that happens between these men and the relationship they build as part of these four humans in my story who work together to stop the bad guys and each experiencing his own life and struggle with good and evil. They run directly parallel to the aliens. There's a recurring set of extraterrestrials in all of my novels, called the Hooknik, who are feathered serpent beings, is usually how their core self is portrayed, although we can't be certain of that because they are not bound by time and space and are very mysterious. They appear in various forms. One of them, whose name we get, who does recur in my stories, Sir. He goes by the name Sir. And so in the book Harvest of Marshmallows, he actually spends most of the time as a large black man who is a cult leader in the Detroit area of a group of mostly homeless people that are searching for a relic. The relic turns out to actually be real, and it is a product of the Hooknik civilization, and it is a crystal, funnel-shaped crystal that causes time to condense and contract and causes time travel anomalies. But having discovered long ago that there was purpose to it, or at least the outcomes caused by it moving through time couldn't be stopped without affecting everyone's destiny, the Hooknik have been trying across millennia to recover the device in its various forms because it is glass. So for most of our history, it manifests as a glass bottle, usually having been used for liquor, sort of a nice reference to my own being a recovering alcoholic. And it is relatively funnel shaped at the top. Anyway, so the Hooknik are waiting for the day they can recover the relic, but it has to be at the right time to have not interfered with any of the good or bad things it has triggered, which then has affected the outcome and destiny of untold billions of living things over the epochs of time since they first lost it. And so there's a reference to the third commandment, which for them, the third commandment is, you lost it, you find it. And so it's pivotal for them to be able to eventually recover it, but in a proper time. But because the characters, there's the involvement of a police shooting, a black man being shot by a white police officer, the interaction of these men, there's more of the interaction of the multiculturalism in America, and other things which, conversely would seem like absolute mindless pandering, like what's going on with the woke destruction of all popular media and pop culture right now, or it looks ridiculously dated, being a product of, so communism in the West has come about in basically four phases, and it has begun in the early 1800s. And so there's primarily four phases. And in hindsight, quite a bit of my writing was a product of phase 2 or 3 thinking about the world. And so I was repeating some of these themes, which were really meant to be part of the narrative of the completely fictionalized world that the dialectic is presenting today. So luckily, my first published novel, which you can find under my name at Amazon, if you like, or email me and I'll send you the altered, modified, updated PDF version for free. It's not like I get royalties on it. The Life Tree trilogy didn't contain very much of that, so it's not a problem for me. But my other works did, and so I've been sort of truncating them. And what you have before you in this playlist from A Harvest of Marshmallows are the bits and pieces that I was most pleased with the way they came out, poetically speaking, and the imagery, and without the story. Although you get a little bit of it if you, I mean, you don't know it, but the interaction between John and Henry, Walt Carlson, I'm sorry, and Henry and John. This has to do with the young man who had died decades before, because we live longer in the future, I presented. But you do get to meet these characters, and so you meet the 4 human characters plus Sir, plus the quartet at the very end, and the way that the music blends together at the end with the second coming of Christ. A lot of my work, being a Christian, ends with the second coming of Christ. My first novel ended with the second coming, but I sort of, because it doesn't happen in time and space as we know it, I sort of speed up to it. It's not that the world keeps ending over and over again in my stories. It's just that I sort of skip there as to how this story connects to that. And it's sort of like the book of Revelation tacked on the end. It's the way to wrap it up in this poetic sort of artistic way. So that's the story of why The Harvest of Marshmallows. I came up with the idea for the goofy title because I had this short story that I separated. And in the original version of the collection, it was the first, the very middle, and the very end stories all related to the story about Zeke and discovering that it's actually the refuse left behind by the Hooknick Quartet that is sugary and sweet and slightly crunchy on the outside like toasted marshmallows. And I don't even know if they had marshmallows in the Old West, but that's when they first appear in the novel during the time travel sequence. And so that's where they appear in the story. So this is, for your enjoyment, such as it is, the bits and pieces of the now incomplete novel, The Harvest of Marshmallows. Thank you. The whole train station was abuzz. It was quite sensational for these parts. People came from all around, and everyone had to stop and try Zeke's little white puffs. Fresh off the train for a little gambling, Doc Holliday stopped at the little booth by the house along the tracks to take a taste. "These are wonderful," he crunched away. "Crispy outside, soft inside, better than the ones they have in Europe." "Thanks, mister," Zeke replied. "You new around here?" "Name's Harrison," Doc lied, preferring to be incognito. "Just stopping in for a spot of poker and a shot of gin. I love your marshmallows." "Marshmallow?" It piqued Zeke's interest. "Marshmallow," Doc reiterated. "That's what they call 'em in England." The eavesdropping bartender pulled the blind shut and walked back behind the bar. "Marshmallows my hind end," he exclaimed, "leaving me just 2 customers." Alone at a table, a large man staring at the wall trembled and shouted, 3! "Sorry, Jehoiakim," the bartender quipped sarcastically. "I forgot about the dimwit. 3 customers." The bartender filled 2 whiskeys, then disappeared into the back. "Don't pay him no mind, Jehoiakim," Court encouraged and tipped his hat. "He just being cantankerous." "He still shouldn't poke fun at him," Lauren sipped his whiskey. "He can't help the way that he is." Lauren looked across the room towards Jehoiakim. "And he's a good-hearted boy." Jehoiakim smiled and kept staring at the wall. "Right." "Everyone's been cantankerous lately," Court sighed. "It's been a long drought. Nobody's got a crop to sell. Killing all the business around here." "Nobody but Zeke," Lauren reminded. "Zeke and his crazy harvest of marshmallows." "Marshmallows!" Jehoiakim shouted. "Harvest?" Court wondered aloud. "They sprout up?" "Hell if I know," Lauren shrugged. "They gotta come from someplace." "Sugar!" insisted Jehoiakim. "Yeah, maybe," Court nodded. "I hear they're sweet. Maybe he whips them up in his kitchen." "Well, he's making bushels of money selling them," Lauren snickered. "Old Zeke, worst farmer in the county. and the only one's going to weather the drought. Whoever would have thought it? Jehoiakim barely whispered. Lauren and Court looked over at him curiously. Yeah, Lauren repeated. Whoever would have thought it? All right, I've had enough whiskey, Court declared. I'm going to go try me one of these marshmallows. Let's all go, Lauren nodded and finished off his whiskey. Come on, Jehoiakim, we'll get one for you too. Delicious, Court exclaimed with exaggerated tone. My mouth wants to yell yee-haw. What else would you yell with? Lauren chuckled. But I agree. Yee-haw! Jehoiakim shouted as he reached for a marshmallow. No, Zeke interrupted. Not him. Not you. Not Jehoiakim. Why not? Court asked. We'll pay for it. You got a problem with slow folks? Lauren quipped. Zeke blushed. No, of course not. It's just... What? He's such a totally innocent soul. I couldn't do that to him. They looked at him suspiciously as Court swallowed the last of his marshmallow. Do what to him? Lauren pulled the second half of his away from his face. He put his hand on his pistol just to exaggerate the effect. What are you feeding us, Zeke? Zeke scowled with a guilty look. Aw, hell. It's been bothering me for a while. I just got to tell somebody. Might as well be you boys. The two men leaned in closer to Zeke. No, not here. I have to show you to believe it. They leaned back as Zeke went on. You just don't eat anymore. I'll be at my farm at dusk. You keep it a secret. Maybe I'll share some profits with you. We'll keep it secret for now, Court affirmed. We'll be there, Lauren nodded. Tonight, Jehoiakim shouted. A few months ago, Lincoln pulled forward. Zeke slipped on the loose soil and fell past the plow to the earth below. Sitting up, his face covered in mud, he swore loudly. Over by the barn came wild neighing, as if the horse, Grant, were laughing at him. Grant was laughing at Zeke. It's not funny, Lee chided Grant. It's sort of funny, Grant retorted. Lee shook her head. If the farm goes bust, what's going to happen to us? Grant couldn't answer that. I don't know, but poor Zeke is the worst farmer in the county. Lee couldn't help but agree. He's certainly not the man his father was, but he tries very hard. In the field nearby, Lincoln the mule was looking forlornly toward Grant and Lee. Lee tried to smile reassuringly. She failed. Lincoln pulled forward again and the plow dug in nicely, laying a deep furrow. Zeke more or less stumbled behind, barely given enough solid pressure downward. Leave it to Lincoln, Grant snipped. He'll manage to get it done. Lincoln can't milk me, Lee observed. We can't do everything for Zeke. What Zeke needs is money, Grant thought out loud. Then Ricky's parents would let him work down here again. Money, Lee thought to herself. Where would Zeke get money? I'm going out to pasture, she declared sorrowfully. I'll be back. Lee wandered out into the back country, grazing on grass and other foliage along the way, following the course of the river and enjoying the tasty fauna sprouting up along its moist banks. She came to a sudden halt. A strange, tattered bag was nestled in the grass by the river. She sniffed it, shoved her nose inside. Ew, small bits of rusty metal scratched her pink nose. She pulled back and turned her head sideways to peer inside with her left eye. Some old metal in a bottle, she murmured. Wonder how it got out here. Losing interest in the small mystery, she continued on. Heading up a small rise in the earth, Lee heard a strange sound. Near the top of the hill, she peered over and she was shocked. She couldn't believe what she was looking at. A few minutes later, Lee mustered the courage to approach that part of the property. She sniffed. She sniffed at the strange stuff hewn about the earth. She sniffed it. It smelled sweet. Cautiously, she nibbled. Moo, Lee insisted to Zeke. Moo, moo, moo. At times like this, she wished humans could speak the animal language. Moo, she declared. Moo. After a while, her insistence at least paid off. Zeke decided to follow her where Lee was steering him. Down along the river, they came to a rise in the earth. Just over the rise, Lee looked again. If anything, Zeke was more shocked than Lee had been. He just stood there, crouched down to the earth, looking. When the time was right, Lee strolled over the hill and began nibbling on the strange stuff in the ground. She glanced over at Zeke and was pleased to see how intrigued he was. With some trepidation, Zeke came over and sniffed the little white puffs. He glanced at his right and at his left and began gathering some of them up in the folds of his shirt. Back at the house, Zeke rinsed the white puffs and placed them in a large bowl on the counter. His face still bore the baffled look of a man who was experiencing in real life something stranger than fiction. Lee stood with her head poking in the window of the cabin. "Eat one," she insisted, somewhat frustrated. "Just try one." Zeke heard only moo, 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 moo. "It's all right, Lee," he responded incorrectly. "They won't hurt you." "We're so close to a great discovery," Lee mooed. "Just do it." Just then they were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come on in," Zeke bellowed. "It's open, of course." The door creaked open, and Ricky, the neighbor boy, stepped inside. "Morning, Ricky," Zeke acknowledged glumly. "It's good to see you, but I ain't got any work for you today." "Oh, that's okay," Ricky belted out quickly. "I was really just stopping by to wish Lee a happy birthday." Zeke had completely forgotten. A few years back, they accidentally discovered in Lee's papers that she and Ricky were born on the same day. "Holy Moses on Sinai," Zeke thought to himself. "I forgot Ricky's birthday." Ricky rubbed Lee's face and draped his arm around her huge neck. "Happy birthday, girl." "And you too," Lee mooed. "Happy birthday." It didn't take long for Ricky to take note of the large bowl Zeke was staring at suspiciously. Ricky stepped over. "Smells sugary sweet," he observed. "Did you whip up something for my birthday?" Before Zeke could protest, Ricky shoved his hand in the bowl and came out with a white puff to shove in his mouth. The boy moaned. "That's delicious." Zeke got a glimmer in his eye. "Really?" "Uh-huh." Ricky ate another one. "Almost crunchy on the outside and gooey on the inside. Very sweet." Zeke almost tried one himself, but he couldn't. "If you can whip up stuff this good, you ought to sell it," Ricky declared. "Yes," Lee mooed with joy. "Moo!" "People would line up longer than the bakery when the bread's fresh to get some of these," Ricky rambled. "They's just a little taste of heaven." Zeke stepped down from the wagon and started assembling a pile of lumber. A nice little stand, that's all he needed. A little place to sell the little white puffs. "I hope the supply doesn't run out," he muttered to himself. Affixed to the wagon, Lincoln turned and watched Zeke stoically. Better than plowing, the mule thought quietly. Better than plowing. Now the evening came, and Court and Lauren arrived with Jehoiakim. Zeke met them at the field near his farmhouse. "Keep quiet," Zeke insisted. "Very quiet, and follow me." They made their way through the brush near Lamb Road and into the trees in that old area called Sharon Hollow. On the other side of the trees, they came to a small hill, a little rise, and all four men could hear a strange fluttering, like birds, but very large birds. It was big. Zeke signaled them to stay quiet. Lauren and Court followed his lead and signaled to Jehoiakim. All four men got down and crawled slowly to the top of the hill and peeked over. Large, snake-like creatures with feathered wings were writhing around in the clearing. Mesmerized, they just watched. "The Thunderbird," Lauren whispered. "The Indians used to see these things." "No," Court whispered back. "It's the feathered serpent. They worshipped it down south." The two men shook their heads, and Court smacked Zeke gently on the shoulder. "This is incredible, but what does it have to do with—" At that instant, Jehoiakim trembled and couldn't hold it anymore. "Marshmallows!" Hearing the shout, the feathered serpent saw the men were there and began fluttering about in a panicked state. They hissed and chirped and cawed and fluttered in surprised terror. Finally, they outstretched their wings and lifted off from the earth, arcing their rear ends and relieving themselves as they took off. The little white puffs of goo slid with firm outsides, plopped unceremoniously to the earth. "Marshmallows!" Jehoiakim shouted again, in recognition as the feathered creatures disappeared into the sky. Zeke hung his head in shame. It's... Lauren started to gag. "You've been feeding us," Court choked. "Poop!" Jehoiakim shouted. "It's poop!" Lauren and Court vomited all over the little hill in Sharon Hollow. The horse strode gently down the old trail towards the cozy little shack in the distance. A cool breeze was blowing the leaves of fall across the fields, the ancient trees that shed them looking on unconcerned. Fall comes and fall goes, and so does winter, they knew. But the spring would be back, and life and growth. The ancient trees had seen it more times than they could recall, and shed their leaves without fear. The horse passing by them bore the burden of a man in blue who straightened his wide-brimmed cap in the breeze as the gold bands decorating it continued to wag like the horse's own great tail in the wind. The horse and rider arrived at the shack. The rider stepped down. He stopped, shook his head, and offered a silent prayer. So much death, so much destruction he had seen. The war was dragging on so much longer than expected, and yet he knew he would rather face a whole brigade of rebels alone than the task that lay before him. This time he didn't even need to knock. The door to the shack swung slowly open, creaking, to reveal a lovely young woman, her brown hair wafting in the breeze and her eyes already starting to water up. "Ma'am," he removed his hat and bowed slightly. "I regret to inform you." He could not continue. The woman in the door shrieked, long and loud, that horrible, mournful shriek he had heard too many times, both at once happy homes and on the battlefield itself. Her eyes erupted like volcanoes of sadness and heartache, and the shriek turned to moans as she first fell to her knees and then slumped down. Strong and sturdy, useful and reliable. Oh yes, Sharon had used it many times and for many purposes. As she let herself slump off the limb of the ancient tree, the rope did her its final duty. Her neck snapped and she dangled peacefully. Darkness settled in and her emptiness was complete. The trees couldn't understand her impatience. Bad times come and bad times go, like a great circle, a cycle, a whirlpool. What falls today regrows tomorrow. Why couldn't she have waited? Of course, she had been suffering greatly, yet the trees could not grasp her limited point of view. They were not tied to time with the same fastness she was. A voice disrupted her rest, and she opened her eyes. "Sharon?" A man with dark hair was standing before her. "Wake up, Sharon." She noted his dark robe and the large sigh he was leaning on. Given the unnatural way her neck was twisted and affixed to the rope as she dangled, she should not have been able to speak. But she did. "You're the Reaper," creaked out of her mouth. "May we go now?" "Time," said the dark-haired man. "Time itself is in flux now. You're no longer tied fast to it. I know you don't understand," he stroked his dark hair. "But simply put, bubbles of time have formed, freezing and moving and changing what used to be inviolate, what is." She whimpered, still not understanding, but afraid of what he meant. "You get to stay here." He leaned in close to her twisted flesh. "You don't get to go anywhere." The dark-haired man walked away and disappeared. Trapped in her rotting flesh, Sharon shrieked out a horrible, mournful shriek. The ancient trees trembled. Had they been able, they would have wept at her horrific state. She dangled there, shrieking. The evening fog from the nearby swamp began to cover her. She shrieked. Century, more than a century, and another century. And every night at dusk still, she shrieked. The locals called it the ghost of Sharon Hollow. The water wheel of the old mill was aged and dilapidated. It hadn't been used to grind grain in decades, as electricity had replaced its labor and left it to its restful retirement. It sat there, half in the water, occasionally creaking with the wind and enjoying the shade. Small waves broke against her, bringing in the refuse of modern society. Cans and plastics, jugs and bottles wafted into the shade with her, discarded by the thoughtless and disrespectful. The old wheel was annoyed at having to share its retirement spot with this junk. At least she had those 3 boys. Once again, they skidded their bikes to the shore of the river and started fishing. Before long, they had filled a good-sized bag. Rick kept fishing, determined to get that floating glass bottle just out of reach. Leave it, his friends told him. That's vodka. There's no deposit on that. Rick had no clue what vodka was. His family didn't drink. His 2 friends rode off with a bag to collect the deposits. We'll be late for school, they chided. We'll give you your share later. Rick reached in one more time and slipped. The water wheel laughed in her own peculiar way with creaking as Rick pulled himself up out of the water. That's so not cool, he scolded as if he had heard her giggle. Rick made his way to his bike, thought about the time, and then shot away quickly. He could go home and change. He'd be late for school, but Mom and Dad weren't home. He could explain later. Not too long later, a dry, redressed Rick coasted down the hills of Manchester. For the moment, he was the fastest thing in the town's empty streets. Sometimes he wondered what it would be like to live in a big city. Often it felt like there was a whole world he didn't have access to here. He had grown up seeing a world on television and shows and news that he wondered if he would ever see. Everything was so far away from here. Rick skidded up to the school, parked his bike on the rack, and headed off to the office to surrender himself and ask for a hall pass. I'm sorry I was late, but the school secretary was not listening as he burst through the door. She was cradling a box of tissues and crying. Rick looked to his right and left to see the guidance counselor and vice principal in their respective offices. Him sitting blankly, staring, and her looking down at her desk forlornly. Only then did it register with Rick that the principal was speaking over the intercom, and he hadn't even noticed it as he rushed in the door. The shuttle launched. She exploded. No survivors. A moment of silence for the shuttle crew. Rick backed out of the office and went down the hall. He went back outside by the bike rack and looked up. For a brief moment, in a faraway, far greater world, the world had come to Manchester. It didn't seem so far from here. Rick paused there several moments, watching heavenward, as if he could see them slip the surly bonds of earth and touch the face of God. Walt Carlson trembled with thoughts of long ago. The train pulled away from the station in Manchester. It reminded Walt that, he had been here before, 200 years ago, plus. The little tracks near the little house on Lamb Road. Was it yesterday that he was here, or 1,000,000 years ago? They had chased the criminal bullseye through time, traveled through time into the past. Gosh, it seemed like yesterday. Or was it 1,000,000 years ago? The truth is, he had lived so long that it really was closer to 1,000,000 years ago than it was yesterday. Of course, this train was nothing like the ones they had seen back then. The trains in the past were lumbering, metallic monsters, belching out torrents of poison like dragons of legend. These modern plastiform cars, floating on cushions of air, seemed to Carlson more futuristic than anything he had seen in the science fiction of his youth. The future is now. The future was here. The future had come in ways many had not predicted. Through the suburbs, they jetted along rapidly, Walt's mind flooded with memories of long ago, as if the speed of the train were propelling him back across time again. Abruptly, yet with impossible softness, they careened to a halt in Dearborn, the last stop before downtown Detroit. Carlson looked out the window and marveled how everything had changed except humanity. The city skyline in the distance was towered over by the huge mushroom shapes of the pollution collectors, and the air fairly reeked of the purified air the gargantuan fungi were dumping back out in clouds of pink steam. Yet everywhere there was smoke. It wafted out of the restaurants and bars, off the stoves and the grills. The smoke wafted in now and blocked out the smell of purification. Someone was roasting a goat, and in violation of the law, Arab men were nearby, huddled into a narrow alley, partaking of a hookah. Tobacco fumes danced around in violent struggle against the pink clouds of purified air wafting in from above. Cairo, Walt said out loud, to no one in particular. Dearborn still reminds me of Cairo. Cairo? Walt looked to his left to see a curious young woman. I was stationed there in the Army briefly, Walt explained. Hell, that was 80, 90 years ago. She offered the amused smile of a young person indulging an old man. Walt shook his head. When I was your age, people didn't live to be as old as me, he gave the obligatory answer as he patted the tattered old bag on his lap. I never expected to get this old. Damn inconvenient. Luckily, it was a short walk from the air train stop to the old alley on Gratiot. There's that crazy Lutheran, he jibed. Stefan Martinez smiled and shook his head. How many decades am I going to be forced to know you, you old goat? Pipe smoke crept around the corner of the alley. That's got to be Pastor Heiler, Walt declared. Still breaking the law, I see. Heiler came into view as Carlson turned the corner into the alley. Civil disobedience, he said, against an unjust law. It's the American way. As the three men exchanged handshakes, another voice made the turn around historic Trinity Church. I gave up smoking years ago. Carlson was stunned as he turned. John, I don't know what to say. It's been a long time. John offered his hand and Walt shook it. Still chasing those bad guys? Walt tried to find the voice to explain, but Stefan interjected. I remember John, the man shook. Henry's brother. Suddenly the story came back to Heiler's rusty memory. I've heard. It's nice to meet you. Without warning, an ancient blank door opened into the alleyway. They turned to see a large black man step out and wipe his forehead. A single bead of sweat dropped from his nose to the parched earth. It was Sir. I'm glad you all could make it. Heiler almost dropped his pipe. You haven't aged a day. Sir just smiled. Did you bring the bag? Walt slowly handed it over. The old bag of bullseye stuff recovered when they got him in the past. It's been in an old evidence locker in Manchester for decades. They didn't need it after he confessed. Sir unzipped the ancient closure and reached in. The bottle was there. It's here. Why are we all here? Martinez asked. And what's with the bottle? Heiler almost choked on his pipe smoke. It's it. The bottle. It's the relic, isn't it? This is what you've been seeking? Carlson was incredulous. You and your cult? Across a century of time? Traveling through time? A glass bottle. But you knew where it was, otherwise why track me down and have me bring it to you? Sir waved his large hand in a dismissive gesture. Because timing is everything. Something in his demeanor moved them all to silence as he went on. Now is the time. This is the place. All things happen for some reason along the cycle and need to happen, but now is the time to find the relic. Sir rummaged around in the trash of the alley and carefully sat the bag down. Sir raised an eyebrow. The artifact will start doing incredibly unlikely things now. The bad news is craziness and chaos will ensue. The boundaries of reality itself are now in question. After a long silence, Martinez pushed the issue. But there's good news? Sir put his large hands on the shoulders of Martinez and Hyler. Oh, yes. The good news is, now that chaos is totally out of control, I know exactly where to find the artifact. Sir strode away into the waiting pool of followers, leaving Stefan to wonder aloud. How can he be certain if chaos is the norm? Unlikeliness, grasped Pastor Hyler. What if there's logic behind chaos? Martinez's brain fell over dead. What? Hyler shrugged. It just suddenly occurred to me, even chaos has intelligence behind it, so the principle of uncertainty leading to increasingly unlikely things means that Stefan's brain sort of woke up. Then logic could determine the most unlikely and predict that it's now likely. Most likely, chuckled Hyler, in all likelihood. Sir called to them from the midst of his followers. The artifact has left the city. It has found another playground now. Even time cannot contain it. But you said that now you know exactly where to find it, Martinez protested. Sir smiled and stared up at the sun, like an ancient mystic telling time across untold eons and massive distances. Then he looked down and took a deep breath. Now, he declared, it's time to find the relic. He had set the duffel bag aside and was no longer fishing around in it. But he rummaged through some trash and he came up with a bag and unzipped it. It was the bag. It had moved. He grasped the glass vodka bottle by the neck, pulled it out and held it high in the air for all to see. That bottle is the relic? Hyler was shaken. But it's been here in the alley then, in the trash all along. It just arrived, Sir declared, from the future. Sir's cult followers filled the alley with a collective gasp. We found it. We can't keep it now, though, Sir proclaimed. They all watched, stupefied, as Sir carefully placed the bottle back in the bag, rummaged through the trash, and returned it to where he had found it. As if in answer to their collective silent question, Sir sighed and nodded. We must catch it at the right place in the cycle in order to hold on to it. It's going backwards now. We have to catch it moving forward. A single bead of sweat worked down Sir's nose and dripped slowly to the ground below. 8 wings fluttered hypnotically as the 4 members of the quartet shimmered in the early morning light. Their purple scales reflected a strange prism pattern as they floated there together. The great feathered serpents, the great thunderbirds, the great quartet of the Hooknik people. Sir nodded his head. I have fulfilled the 3rd commandment. You have done well in your task, Sir. The voices blended together in chorus. All things have happened as they were meant to. We have the relic once again, and you are ready to move forward. Sir held out his arms, legs together, and his human form gave way to the feathered serpent. He fluttered before them. And now it is finally time for the next phase, Sir Lur inquired. Yes, the quartet sung out. The time shifting of the device is sufficient for all that remains that it has to do, for the lives of many in many times and places. Sir Lur fluttered furiously for a moment, and the pyramidal glass form floated out into the air between himself and the quartet. Energy streamed from the quartet and surrounded the relic. When the energy dispersed, the relic plunked down on the ground, encased smoothly in metal with the fine points rounded. "Take the funnel," the quartet sang. "Take the funnel and give it to him." "As you wish," Sirler consented. "It shall be fulfilled." An army of light beams launched from the sun and struggled to break through the darkness over Detroit City. A cool fall breeze blew the leaves and they danced gently to and fro. Despite the coolness, beads of sweat broke through on the black man's face as he swigged from the bottle and set it back on the sidewalk. He leaned back in the rickety old chair by the antique shop and strummed his guitar. It was time. The time. All was in tune. "Showtime, Rufus," he said to himself. "Showtime, sir." The guitar erupted as if it had its own life force as he strummed and sang. He chopped at the guitar until it sounded almost drum-like, and he whined out the blues of a tortured soul. A young white boy came by and stopped to listen, mesmerized by the musical poetry. "I want to learn to do that," he belted over the music. "Oh God, how I want to learn to moan the blues." Across the street in a music store, a charismatic white man sat down and strummed the piano. With fingers dancing wild rock and roll, the piano sounded as if to spit out balls of fire. While upstairs in a studio, a white-wigged composer blended with the blues and rock, a wild masterpiece of classical precision. Like some healing miracle in sound, the notes dancing off the violin were fit to shake the world to its core and rebuild it in divine splendor. Just down the street on the corner, a young black man easily freestyle rhymed to the delightful cacophony. Adjusting his sunglasses and bobbing his head slightly, he rapped about real life in the streets and the city and dreams. The whole city seemed to come alive. The music had revived it. It had revived it just in time to die. The trumpet had sounded and the heavens had split open and Jesus was coming. But how wonderfully it all blended together. How could they have gone through life not recognizing it before? All the connectedness. In the old fort, the ghosts of the Army of Independence lay aside their phantom weapons and smiled at the coming of peace, the peace for which they had died. Detroit assembly lines paused from their humming activity, and down in Dearborn, the smells and tastes of old Cairo filled the air, while children stopped playing in the parks and riding bicycles in the street and looked up. People of all variety paused downtown to hear the music in the distance. They smiled. They danced. Afterword. I was in high school when I first began seriously reading, and I fell in love with the works of Bradbury, Orwell, Huxley, Clarke. At some point, I felt inspired to attempt writing and wasn't happy with the results. I basically gave up. Then in 1996, I was having lunch with Ray Bradbury when I started entertaining thoughts of trying it again. Okay, I never really had lunch with Ray Bradbury. I fancy thinking about it that way sometimes. In reality, I spent 4 hours in line at a book signing to get his autograph. I lingered at the table until he shook my hand. Clearly dedicated to his fans in a particularly wonderful way, that overworked author was eating a sandwich with one hand and signing books with the other, and he paused anyway to shake my hand. I had just polished off a candy bar I was carrying to sustain me through the long wait in line, and so, well, that was my lunch with Ray Bradbury.